So we're going to start out. We're going to have Heather give us a short presentation on what her book is about on the Green River. And then we'll move on to Eric, and he can go further into depth on your subject. And then we'll have a freewheeling conversation between them and you. So be prepared to join the conversation. So, Heather.
Can you guys hear me okay? Thanks. So I figured I'd give you guys a little bit of kind of the quick and dirty on the book that I'm working on right now, and then back up a little bit to talk about my background and then why that kind of informed why I wanted to write about the green, and then bigger picture why I think other people are writing about it and why I think it's important to tell stories about rivers. Wrong notes. My book is about the green, and I paddled pretty much the whole thing last summer. I skipped some big chunks of the reservoirs because I'm not a total glutton for punishment. And I kind of used that trip to I stopped along the way and talked to, people who worked in ag and city managers and fish biologists about what they were doing on the river, and what their priorities were and kind of how they fit together and grinded up against each other and didn't. Eric kind of said something that stuck with me this morning about paper problems and real problems, and I really kind of wanted to get into those real problems and what was happening on the ground, to look at what was kind of how those informed the paper problems. And being on the river was the best way that I knew to do that. And kind of talking about scope of books, as I'm sure probably everybody here knows, trying to talk about supply and demand and water use is this kind of like big, massive, many-tentacled topic that's wrapped up in history and science and policy and economy. So for me, kind of dialing into the green and focusing on that was a way to tell that story and make it feel kind of less overwhelming and give it context and give it shape. So I started up in the Upper Green River Lakes, and from there I went down to the Upper Green River Valley, and I talked to people who worked in ag there about what they were doing, and kind of their ideas on conservation and what they saw in the future and what they were nervous about, and how that played into conservation exchanges and things like that. From there I went to Rock Springs and Green River, Wyoming. And do I have the clicker, or those guys have it? Oh, sorry. So there's a couple of pictures here of kind of what I saw along the way. And from there, I went into, like I said, Rock Springs and Green River to look at what the water port there was doing in terms of municipal water use, and then pulled back to look at what happens as Salt Lake and Denver and those places grow, and how that impacts the upper basin. I went and hung out at Flaming Gorge and Fontenelle and looked at how those guys manage storage there and also work within the bounds of power and the endangered fish program, and kind of, especially in Flaming Gorge, think about all the stakeholders who are working there on the river. I went and looked at fish fry with the fish biologists who work on the endangered fish program. I tagged along on a commercial river trip through the gates of LaRue to look at how those guys and the recreation economy kind of has a stake in water and doesn't have power over that. I talked to people who work in oil and gas in the Uinta Basin, and I went and talked to the Ute tribe about their settlement and what could potentially happen there. So I kind of tried to, as I was moving downriver and as I was learning about all these things, kind of tried to tell a story of how all those pieces fit together, and what that means kind of for current water use and what that potentially is going to mean for future water use. You guys, a couple more. These places might look familiar to some people. What else did I see? That's the one on the left is the very glamorous river life when you're traveling downstream by yourself. And so to kind of back up and give you guys a little bit of context about me and kind of why I wanted to do this, I'm a journalist and a reporter, but I was a river guide before that. And this is probably unpopular to say here, but I am from the East Coast originally, and I started guiding there on the rivers in Maine, and then I moved to Colorado in 2005 and worked on the Ark and the Eagle in the Upper Colorado. And when I kind of stopped doing that seasonal thing, I went back to journalism school at CU in their environmental journalism program. And my thesis work was on dust on snow and runoff. And so I kind of thought of myself as this person who had this personal stake in rivers and also kind of a little bit of an academic background in water. And I still wasn't reading stories and kind of finding things to read about that really explained to me the context of the Colorado River Basin and kind of water in the West in general. And, you know, as long as I lived in the West, there's kind of been this talk of drought and shortages and basin, you know, reservoir levels dropping. And it felt like there still wasn't, even though this was probably the biggest thing that was going to impact people, there still wasn't a ton of storytelling and reporting that felt like it gave context to that and kind of talked about the big picture problems with it and also kind of the concrete stuff that was happening on the ground. And I think there's sort of a couple reasons for that. And one of them is, you know, from the journalistic side and the reporting side, you're always kind of looking for a story in the news and kind of what the hook is and finding a way to tell a story. And for a lot of these kind of big picture water use problems and, you know, any kind of large scale, I think, environmental or natural resource issue that kind of moves slowly and happens on a really broad scale, it can be really hard to wrap your hands around that and kind of tell a story about that. And so that, you know, that makes it hard for reporters. You know, Jack kind of made a comment poking at reporters during his talk, but it's a really kind of hard thing to both give context and credence to all the science and the policy in the background that's important while still getting to the news and what's going on there. And so when I started working on this project 2 years ago, I really wanted to kind of dig into that because it felt like there was a really big gap there. And I think that's changed a little bit in the last few years. I know John Fleck, who's spoken here quite a bit, had a really good book come out, and David Owen had a book come out about the Colorado, but there still is kind of this trope in talking about books about water to always go back to Cadillac Desert, and even Bill kind of mentioned this morning that that still is the standard. And that's an amazing book. I think probably everybody in here knows that. But it's also 30 years old, and it's like a total brick. Like you really have to want to read that book. So, sorry, it's true. And so it felt really important to me to write a book that was both kind of current and looked at what was going on now, and also was really like something that was digestible and that my mom or that somebody who lives in Denver who just turns on their tap and doesn't really think about water that much could pick up and understand and kind of engage with. Because I think, you know, I think somebody this morning said, water is life. Like, this is the biggest thing that's going to touch on everybody. And so I think it's really important to give context to that and to tell stories about that and to make sure it's something that, even if you're not working in water every day, even if you're not, you know, farming or working in a water district, that you can kind of understand what's going on and see what the stakes are so that everyone knows what's happening and kind of knows what their stake is. Yeah, and so for me, kind of using a river trip to tell that story and to give it a narrative and give it shape and to show what was actually happening on the ground felt really important. And I, kind of over the past couple years, I got a chunk of time to spend with George Wendt, who some of you guys might know, founded Oars Rafting Company and kind of was a big deal in kind of building commercial rafting, which is my line into the water world. And he had this saying that he would say a lot that's maybe a little bit hokey, but I thought about a lot when I was writing this, which was his thing is that we save what we love and we love what we know. And I think that that is sort of a really true way of thinking about water use, because it's really hard to care about things that you don't care about. So I think kind of using storytelling as a tool to show people what the stakes are and why they should care, and why, you know, water use impacts them, even if they don't see it day to day, is a really kind of important way to tell these stories of things that, you know, hit everybody's lives. So that's my, and that's the end. That's the confluence of the Green and the Colorado there. So that's where I ended my book, but there's, you know, so much that happens downstream of that. So. Yep.
Give me notes.
Yeah, all right. And what I've done over the years is we've spent at the River District, I consider us to be at the stretch of the rubber band. We are caught between the east slope and the downstream states. Sometimes we get focused on the east slope and we lose track of what's going down, what's happening downstream, and I didn't want us to ever lose track of that. So I've done a lot of work on what happened. Why did we end up with Lake Powell? Why did we end up with Lake Mead? What did we know? When did we know it? And I thought this is a good time as I'm heading toward something, I'm not sure, I haven't wrapped my head around it yet, but I guess it's called retirement, that it put it down and it'll give me something to work on. So just about 10 years ago now, in 2007, I did a white paper. We published it. It was called The Quest for Certainty on a Diminishing River. And I figured that about 5,000 of those have been downloaded, which is quite a significant amount. We handed them out to all of the roundtables, and I still see that as being quoted in a number of things, including a recent large piece, or not large piece, a recent University of Wyoming Law School generated effort on the Colorado River. So I thought, we need to do more of this. It is very nerdy. That's fine. That's me. That'll be me for a long time. But that's what I'm doing. So, and my effort here is, in terms of the Colorado River hydrology, and by hydrology, it's the basics. It's the flow, the average flow, the depleted flow, the length, and the droughts. How deep did they get, and how long did they last? The wet periods. We often forget about wet periods. How wet were they? How long did they last? And we need to know that if we're going to have a good understanding of the river and can make better decisions into the future. So what I'm focusing on is, what did we know? When did we know it? Critically, how did we use this information, this hydrologic science, for decision making? When I got into that, I found it was really a fascinating story. We used it, but we sort of selectively used it. And we selectively used it to sort of shape the argument that we want to make in Congress or with the other states. Now, everyone did it. It was considered a part of the game at the time, but it led to some decisions that, if we were to do over again, I think would be very different. And I'm going to get into that. And then, how can we use the lessons from the past to help us make better decisions in the future? Real quickly, this is one of the stories, and one of the several stories that I'm going to be looking at, and that's the fact that we think that the compact commissioners made a mistake and they allocated too much water because of this happenstance, if you would call it, an accident of when they negotiated the compact. That is partially true, and it's partially false. They negotiated the compact in 1922, and the period from about 1905 to 1930 was extremely wet. It's probably one of the 3 or 4 wettest periods in the last 1,500 years. We've looked back, we've done paleohydrology, we've reconstructed flows back to about 700, or actually 600, and we know how wet it is. Now, those reconstructions aren't great for individual years, but they're really good for looking at length of droughts and length of wet periods. So there's this impression that, yes, we negotiated the compact right there. And what the red is the running 10-year average, which is important to the Colorado River because our obligation at Lee Ferry is a 10-year running total of 75. So that's a 10-year running average of 7.5. The blue lines are the best estimates we have of the individual flows at Lee Ferry from 1878 to 2014. Why did I pick 1878? Well, that's the first year we really had information. That year, there was a bridge built in Yuma, Arizona. That bridge went over the Colorado River, and beginning with the completion of that bridge, they took twice a day stage readings every day for the next almost 25 years at that bridge. And that essentially became what is a gauge? It's a stage reading, You need to know the topography of the river, and you need to know the velocity. They didn't have the velocity. They didn't have the river, what the topography of the river was at the time, but they could reconstruct those once they did have a sophisticated gauge in place. They put those gauges in the early 1900s. So by about 1920, they could make a really good correlation between those river stage readings at Yuma and the gauge information that they had based on the flow. And a couple of enterprising USGS hydrologists did that, and lo and behold, this average here, this green is the average to date. So the first year on that is 1879. That's an average of 1878 and 1879. So by the time you get, let's say, to 1933, it's the average of everything from 1878 to 1933 on out to 1878 to 1914. And this was the story, was, well, yes, the compact was negotiated in 1922 when it was really wet. There was a dry period from about 1870 to 1905 that was very similar to from about 1930 to about the early 70s, and quite frankly, very similar to what we're going through right now. Now, well, how come was that information available? The answer was yes, it was available. It was published. It was understood by USGS hydrologists. It was sort of understood by the Bureau of Reclamation. So when they negotiated the compact, they used what was called the Fall-Davis report. Arthur Powell Davis was the nephew of John Wesley Powell, and he was the Reclamation Service Director. Albert Fall was the Secretary of the Interior. So they called it the Fall-Davis report. They decided to cut things off at about 1900, and they sort of ignored what happened from 1878 to 1905. So it's a myth that the compact negotiators had only information that would tell them there was about 20 million acre-feet of water available. They knew what was going on before 1878. Now, there's a good reason to discount it, saying, well, we didn't really have a gauge because we didn't have the velocity reading. Well, some other enterprising people looked at, one, records of precipitation. The Mormon settlers kept really meticulous records on places like where they settled as they moved away from Salt Lake City. And they kept them on a daily basis. Those records are available. You look at it. They've really done a number of things to verify that from the 1870s to about 1900 was indeed a dry period. So what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about, all right, had they used that information here, what kind of decisions, how would decisions have been different in the Colorado River? And I'm coming to the conclusion that we still would have had a compact, but it might be slightly different than today because they couldn't have justified going out with apportionments of 16 million acre feet plus a surplus, which was really important. So that's really the story. And then if you look at this along the lines, there's lots of other information. There are lots of other decisions, like the decision to build Hoover Dam, which occurs right about here, the Mexican Treaty, which is right in here, the 1956 Storage Project Act here, the 1968 Act here, and the interim guidelines. So this is the story. I agree, it's nerdy. Its audience is relatively limited, which is why it's going to be an academic publication. A number of them are interested in it, very interested in it, but we haven't decided which one yet, so we're doing a little negotiating with them. And I look forward to finishing this up and providing some thought to those people who are really interested in this story. Notes, our understanding of the river was surprisingly modern by the early 1920s. How we used this information was messy. And in general, politics overruled conservative decision-making. When I talk about conservative, I mean classic conservative decision-making, like you have a conservative investment portfolio or a conservative dam design. And they argued about how conservative they should be with hydrology. And they ultimately decided that it's easier, the politics were easier if you overstated the hydrology than it would be if you understated it. And they even talked about that in certain publications, and that was kind of an open secret. So with that, I'll sit down and maybe we can have a conversation.
Sure. Heather, I want to come to you in a minute, but Eric, it's a pretty amazing. You could flash up that chart and sell a book, perhaps to a publisher. But having the benefit of reading chapter 5, there's actually character development in this book, so it's not quite all that dry. And there's this one interesting character. His name's LaRue. He was prickly, irascible, but he's the fella that I think you're really talking about, who was telling the truth about hydrology.
Yeah, his name was E.C. LaRue. He was a USGS hydrologist. He was trained at the University of California. I think he graduated in the 1890s. Went to work for the USGS. You know, remember the Bureau of Reclamation, or the Reclamation Service, was one time a part of the USGS. It separated in the early 1900s. It didn't become the Bureau until 1923. And what LaRue basically did was he got into a fight that he couldn't win. He preferred the first dam to be built to be Glen Canyon. LaRue was very much in favor of damming the Colorado River, as were all of the folks in these days. This was an era when if they figured a drop of water made it to the ocean, that was a drop of water wasted. But LaRue decided that he would take on Hoover Dam, and he felt that Glen Canyon Dam should be the first built, and that he designed a series of dams that essentially were heel-to-toe dams, beginning where Heather left off, which is at the confluence of then the Grand and the Colorado, that would maximize water yield, minimize evaporation, and maximize power generation. LaRue also told us that by where we are today, by the end of the 19th century, by about 2000, we would have about a 2 million acre foot deficit in the Colorado River. He predicted that with some amount of certainty, and he had a couple of other colleagues that used some different approaches that essentially came up with the same results. When I say it was unfortunate that he took on the city of Los Angeles and Mulholland and others who wanted primarily to build Hoover Dam because it was closer to the load centers as far as power was concerned, LaRue thought that that power should be more incidental and that water should be the first priority. Others considered power the first priority, and that included the city of Los Angeles. And by the way, a Californian named Herbert Hoover, who was president when the issue was decided.
What you draw out, though, in your draft is it wasn't so much what he was saying, how he said it. You know, it sounded like he could offer you an ice cream cone, you'd still want to punch him in the face.
Yeah, he was, as you said, had a rather prickly personality.
And that seemed to torpedo the work that might have otherwise been accepted.
Yeah, and we also came across another prickly character by the name of George E.P. Smith, who was a professor of irrigation engineering at University of Arizona. He basically said, look, there's not 20 million acre feet, there's about 15, so he was another one. Well-trained, PhD, well-respected in engineering. He took on the lawyers. And in his biography, he basically lambasts the idea that this process would respect or turn to the lawyers for hydrology and ignored his career at determining, at studying how much water was available. But he also had the same problem that LaRue did. People wanted to punch him in the face.
So how kind of having the benefit of looking back and looking at history, how did you kind of decide what to focus on and who the characters were? Like, was the story obvious to you, or did you have to pick and choose?
I had to pick and choose. The story wasn't obvious, but what we're having to do right now, and I have the luxury of a River District board that was supporting me on this. We're using John Fleck, that author, to, his contract is very simply, it's to de-nerdify what I write. And, you know, so we're basically taking what we think is the most interesting, but also the most relevant of this to today's decision making, and trying to put it down. You know, so we keep it in that 300, 350 page range as opposed to, you know, volumes.
So Heather, your book is going to be sort of another approach, as you mentioned, more about storytelling through other people's eyes. And so when you were going up and down the green, I was wondering, you know, what were some of the salient things that were jumping out? What were people talking about? Were they talking about the Flaming Gorge pumpback, which some folks in here would have heard, somewhat controversial? Or, you know, so what kind of things did you glean from your trip?
I think sort of the biggest picture thing that stuck out to me the most, kind of talking to, you know, as I was kind of compiling people's stories along the way, is how many good guys there are, I guess. How much everybody is really trying to do a really good job within the scope of what makes sense for them, and how many people are really kind of not even just looking out for their own interest, but kind of really trying to think bigger picture about how their water use impacts people down the river, and what it might mean, you know, what the ranchers in the upper green, what their kind of aquifer recharges mean for both the animals around them, and how it trickles down and impacts cities down, you know, downstream from them and even pretty far away. And so I think the biggest picture thing that I gleaned is how much people realize how many things are interconnected, and how surprising things were pivots. Like, I think I didn't realize how much the endangered fish program, especially below Flaming Gorge, played into how everybody downstream from that was thinking about what they were doing. And so I think that trying to separate out the storylines there was tricky because everything felt so connected to me. And everyone was thinking much more broadly than I, in my kind of naive assumption, might have assumed.
I read a couple paragraphs from your introduction. Once I found Eric's email that showed me where it was. But you used the word sandpapering. I can't remember if it was a drought or there was some other issue that you said is sandpapering away differences among what otherwise might be, you know, opposing camps. Could you help me with that? What are we talking about?
I think it's kind of this idea that, you know, there's this old trope of, you know, it's fish versus farms, or ag versus cities, or raft guys versus people who are working on oil and gas. And I think that that's not really true anymore. Or that, you know, I think when, like, Paul and Melly and Lorraine were talking about this morning, that when it gets down to the point that you kind of, those fights don't hold up when it becomes really serious, and you actually have to figure out a way to make things work. So I think that kind of, like, you can think about these different uses grinding up against each other, but that doesn't really work in reality.
So let's go back to the bigger picture. For you to embark on a book, I mean, Eric's got a nerdy book, Academic Press, but there is character development. It's going to be good.
You're really selling it.
But your approach is more of a larger market, I suppose. So you probably surveyed what's out there, and you're looking for the niche that you could jump into. But you know, so why is so much being written? Why do you think you can jump in and fill a perhaps an unanswered, you know, something that's not being addressed when so much is being written? So why is this stuff being written? And maybe that's what I'm trying to draw out from the research that you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much is being written because there's so much to talk about. You know, you could write a book about meat and what's potentially going to happen there based on a lot of the research there. I think there are so many storylines and sort of things that, you know, probably half the people in this room could write a book about what they're doing. And so I think that there is this big need, and the kind of challenge is making it sort of tangible and finding those characters and finding those stories and, you know, finding a way to tell that. And I sort of, for me, the kind of river scale stuff is the interesting stuff, so that felt like a story that I had some context on and that I could tell that I wasn't seeing out there.
Anybody who would like to jump into the conversation, please feel free. So Eric, how much would your book cost, do you think?
Have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious too to hear what other people think about, or kind of feel like the cornerstone books to them, or what people want to read about and what they think is interesting and is missing from the dialogue. Oh, yeah, sorry, did you guys hear that?
Oh, right, well, for John, do you have a title for your book? A lot of times a title can be revealing.
Yeah, actually, I would maybe like some feedback about this. This would be helpful. The working title on it is Running the River, which is kind of the idea is that it's a play on actually paddling and then also kind of who's in charge of water. But whenever I say that to somebody who doesn't come from the paddling world or the water world, they think that I actually like jog down the river. So I think I need to rework that a little bit.
We do have a question? Okay.
Yeah.
Question for Eric. Can you hear me okay? In the 1950s, in the western U.S., we had this grand vision of water reclamation. I was wondering if you could describe what the spirit of that was. And obviously, we could not see a lot of the unintended consequences of the big 3 reservoirs that were going to be developed. But what do you think Americans, what do you think the Bureau and the Secretary of Interior were thinking about for America back then? That's a really interesting historical period.
Yeah, the after World War II, I found to be really fascinating from about the late, mid-40s, if you want to call it, to about 1965 or so. And one of the things that I've come to conclude is that, if you were to look at what was the debate in Congress over the Boulder Canyon Project Act and some of the projects in the 30s, it's very similar to today. You had the small government, fiscal conservatives who hated reclamation. And then you had what I would call the more progressive folks who were using reclamation as a way to encourage settlement, provide jobs for World War II World War I veterans, not World War II, provide jobs for the Depression. You saw it as a classic federal stimulus that we talk about today to get out of the Depression. And that debate was pretty intense. And reclamation sort of stumbled into 2 projects that it made that organization. The first was Hoover Dam, and the second was Grand Coulee. Hoover Dam was the largest dam in the world. When they built it, it was over twice as high as the next largest concrete dam. That dam up in Idaho was cracking and had all kinds of problems with it. So it was considered an engineering marvel. And some authors have talked about that it sort of lifted the spirit of the US to build the largest, highest dam in the world. And Grand Coulee became the largest power plant ever built. It's still one of the largest in terms of capacities in the world. And as we went through World War II, Hoover Dam power was used in Southern California for the war effort, and Grand Coulee. The story was that it helped the aluminum industry. What did aluminum do? It went into B-29s, and that's why Seattle is home to Boeing. And in an aircraft industry. So coming out of the 40s, there was the reclamation had huge public support based on the true impression that what they did in the 30s helped the war effort. So at that point in time, that's when Glen Canyon and that's when some of these other big projects, they just carried on the momentum to continue to build these big projects. And it took a while for the small government fiscal conservatives to get back in the game because of the momentum they had in World War II. The other misconception, there was a lot of debate over the Glen Canyon Dam, not so much the dam itself, but the dam provided a subsidy for the development of these small projects. And a lot of folks opposed that. The debate over Glen Canyon and the CRSP was really close. Conservatives opposed it. Most of the, quote, liberals at the time, different definition in the 50s, supported it. And you know, it was Eisenhower was nonpartisan pretty much as a president, and he saw that there was a need and signed it. So it was a really interesting era. But largely reclamation was building on the momentum from Grand Coulee and Hoover Dam, its two real, what I would call trophy projects. And one of the concerns I have is the trophy projects in reclamation, like the CRSP, Glen Canyon, and Hoover Dam, and CAP, and some of these get a lot of attention. They have the money, and it's the small projects like the ones that support the irrigators in the North Fork, like Paonia. We're struggling to rebuild Paonia Reservoir, that it needs to be rebuilt, because where's the money going to come from for something like that? And that's one of the challenges we face, replacing that that infrastructure that reclamation built that was intended for the small farmer, as opposed to those big trophy projects that get all the attention.
Yeah, your concerns about lifespans of the dams.
Is that a question?
Yeah, you have sediment buildup, lifespan of the dams, 50 years plus. How do you take on that issue?
Concern about lifespans of dam. Interesting. You know, dams are like bridges and roads. You know, our experience, and we built and operate dams, is that they take maintenance every year. So they are, the basic concrete or the earth structure is going to stay around a long time, but you maintain them you do maintenance on them all the time, and that requires a lot of money. I've not heard anything other than if we were all to go away tomorrow, you know, and 1,000 years from now, Glen Canyon Dam would still probably be there. You know, it's concrete. It's reinforced concrete. Look at the pyramids. How long have the pyramids lasted? So these structures are going to be there a long time. The earthen structures that might overtop, they'll wear away, but the concrete dams are going to last a long, long time.
I'm really intrigued by one of your conclusions, Eric, that politics overrule conservative decision-making. And you framed your book in terms of lessons of the last 100 years that we can apply to the current situation we're all facing. So I'm wondering if you could give us some insight based on your historical analysis and your intimate knowledge of the challenges we're all facing with the Colorado River, to apply that finding to the types of actions we should be engaged in together.
Good question, and I will say Jack Schmidt mentioned it. I think I have the next big decision-making process in the Colorado River Basin will be the negotiations of the 2007 interim guidelines. Those are how they set the shortage criteria. They tell you how we operate Meade and Powell, even the bigger reservoirs, or the not as big reservoirs like Flaming Gorge. And it's easy, the federal budget is the greatest example of this. It's easy if the politics becomes easier if you overstate how much you have of a resource, because the pie becomes bigger to divide up. You know, so in renegotiating those, are we going to assume higher, you know, better, you know, are we going to wish for better hydrology, which will make it so much easier for the politics back home? Are we going to take a realistic look of what might be there under a number of different scenarios and say, no, we got to be able to handle what might be another 2013 drought period, and that's going to be painful. You know, so that's sort of my lesson, you know, that when I mean conservative is be able to have a decision making that addresses this. We're not afraid to address the problems that we know might be out there, but if we do, it's going to cause people to get into fisticuffs, and especially the states who have these expectations based on things that go back to 1922.
Heather. Test. Okay, Heather. I just participated in some job interviews, so I'm wary about asking personal questions, but it would appear that you're a millennial.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm an old millennial.
Old millennial. But you're going to be in charge. Your generation's going to be in charge here directly, and we have 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
But you know, you look around this room and you see a lot more people, perhaps that look like Eric and me, and than yourself. But what hope would you have for your generation and the natural resources that you care so much about?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Eric was just saying about trying to take a really realistic look at what's going on, even if it causes fights, and even if it's hard, and even if that means that, you know, states have to ease back on their priorities. And it was interesting what Bill was saying today about how California is going to kind of, because it got really hard for them, they had to figure out how to manage that. And I think that people my age and even younger are kind of seeing that and seeing the reality of that. And I think, you know, it's a tumultuous political climate right now. And I think that people my age are really feeling that. So I think that I don't know, I hope for realism, I guess. I don't know how idealistic of a want that is. But I think being really, you know, like looking at the science, trusting the best research and knowledge that we have, and being really concrete in our decision making, and not trying to kind of like give into these false hopes, and being really, you know, realistic and maybe even a little negative, so that we can make things work in the future, I think is maybe not like a really rosy hope, but a realistic one.
So maybe it sounds like you're saying that maybe the power of information will win out in the end.
Yeah, I think so.
Great. Well, here's two folks that are going to be contributing to that information. So look for their books in 2018. We don't know what the titles are. We don't know how much they're going to cost, but now you know them, Heather Hansman and Eric Kuhn. Thank you so much.